We're a company that makes the network work. We don't develop the call processing software like BroadWorks itself. We develop other tools and do other parts of the project, like helping select the software, configuring the software, and doing the integration and remediation as we connect things together. Acceptance testing and compliance certification, so looking at whether you're really meeting all the standards that you need to and want to meet. And then we do training and operations support as well. Brian Tate is going to talk about automation and where BroadWorks system management is evolving.
So I'm excited to talk about automation with BroadWorks, and also maybe touch on some of the security aspects of it too, because it's becoming more hand in hand, the two topics. So I'll start by talking about Ansible, and that was mentioned briefly earlier. I think Mark mentioned that it's a software product that comes out from IBM's Red Hat. So IBM bought Red Hat about a year ago or so, and Red Hat was founded back when I was still in high school. But they've also purchased the CentOS project, and so as they kind of developed expertise for the operating systems that are core to BroadWorks, it only seemed natural in my mind that they would also help integrate with BroadWorks, as BroadWorks and the operating system are seen as something that needs to be working together for security compliance. So what is Ansible? It's an automated software management solution. Some people say it's information technology made simple, because fundamentally it is a software configuration management solution that, in the case of Ansible, it's based on SSH. It uses keys and or passwords to automate configuration tasks. Well, it's something that's sold separately. It's not something that Cisco is going to sell you. But I'm excited about the integration that BroadWorks and Ansible now has with release 24, and even patched back to release 23 and 22. Real quickly, there are some competitors to what Ansible does. You may have heard of Chef, you may have heard of SaltStack, or more likely you've heard of something called Puppet. Each of those are kind of competing with Ansible for automation. BroadWorks chose Ansible to make it easy for BroadWorks operators to integrate their platforms with Ansible to accomplish specifically server software activation. There's some other things that Ansible can help you with, but the real motivation seems to be simplifying software activation, going back to what we talked about, where BroadWorks components are based on a release independent software and don't have patching anymore. So the idea that you may have to upgrade more frequently instead of patching, well, this takes some of those headaches away. Ansible, going back to it real quickly, Ansible has some specific concepts in the way they think of things. So a node in Ansible, it corresponds to a BroadWorks server. And then you can have inventories of those nodes or hosts. And then there's variables, there's modules, which are basically groupings of Python code, because Ansible is based on YAML files in Python. There's a couple of different types of modules. They've got core modules that you get out of the box. And then there's custom modules, which you can either develop or you can get from a third party. So those modules can be organized in ways that become tasks or things that are operated on nodes. And then those tasks can be organized with the modules and the variables and what have you into playbooks. And so those playbooks are really kind of the fundamental term when you're talking about Ansible and BroadWorks. I see someone has already asked, will Cisco provide Ansible playbooks for customers to use? And the answer is yes, they already have. So there's actually a couple of different tar-zip files that are available in Exchange already. One published in July, another in September, for you to work with. So these playbooks depend on Ansible structure, depends on an Ansible deployment, and that deployment typically has what's considered a control server. And it's not actually a BroadWorks server or BroadWorks component. It's a server that does the SSH connection to all the other BroadWorks servers to automate the different tasks and execute the playbook against the different nodes. And when it does that, one of my first questions when I hear something like that is, well, is it redundant? So Ansible is redundant. You can deploy two servers, a primary and a secondary. So if the primary is not doing its job, the secondary can take over. But earlier I said its primary motivation is helping with software activation, but it can do some other things. It can take the software, the binary archive files, basically the installation files, it can transfer those files out to the servers. It can push out license files to the servers. It does it in the usual places by default, the /bw/install. It can do pre-installation checks. It can automate the actual installation or running those new software installation files. Again, I mentioned it can manage the licenses. And then all that is a prelude to the magic of it activating the software. And it's not something that you necessarily have to say, okay, well, I'm going to activate it for one server, then the next server, then the next server. The playbooks allow you to leverage the simultaneous and the sequential nature of running tasks with Ansible so that it will automatically apply the best practices from BroadWorks software management guide about which server to do first, to do the primary first before the secondary. And it handles those dependencies for you. So it makes it easier to get it right. One thing to mention is that it does support R22 and beyond. There is an exception where I've seen where a release 21 SP1 network server is also supported, but the release independent and R22, if patched and beyond, can take advantage of this. One other thing that was mentioned, I think by John earlier, he was talking about the application delivery platform. And I think this is a really cool thing about Ansible, is it offers a way to automate the conversion of your existing profile server and or XSP to become an ADP. So for those of you who are just new to the idea of what an ADP is, it's the new BroadWorks component that hosts the applications much like you had hosted on the profile server and the XSP before. So the ADP is release independent, and it streamlines things with, especially with R24. There is, if I didn't make it clear before, the Ansible, in addition to it having a redundant architecture, it easily supports both redundant and non-redundant BroadWorks solutions. So if you have a geo-redundant BroadWorks platform, and I imagine we all do, it handles the dependencies between those servers and the order. It does this with custom modules. So if I mentioned earlier, there's core modules that you get with Ansible, and then there's custom. Those custom playbooks are basically those playbooks are the custom modules that you need to plug in. It supports Ansible 2.8 and later. So I think the latest Ansible is 2.9, 2.10, depending on how on the edge you want to live. So it's the modern Ansible, and I don't see any concerns with versions there. One more thing I wanted to mention about it is that BroadWorks, in deploying this new feature, and I encourage you to look at the feature description and also the user guide for the Ansible playbooks, it introduces an extra API into the software manager for BroadWorks. And that API, kind of like a shell command, it has some JSON output from it, and it allows Ansible to be used in such a way where it can automate the locking and the unlocking of BroadWorks through the software manager, which wasn't possible before. It can query application states for BroadWorks, and then it's actually what does the software activation when the time comes. So I think it begs a couple of interesting questions with BroadWorks and Ansible. One is, who supports Ansible in your deployment? Ansible is it's used a lot on CentOS 7, CentOS 8 servers, which sometimes in some organizations and enterprises and service providers, that tends to be something that's used by the server team or the IT, the data, maybe even a hybrid networking / server team. But in this case, it's giving the BroadWorks or the voice operators an opportunity to leverage their leverage the Ansible tool in a way that maybe previously only your systems or your automation engineers were using. So check your organization, see where the Ansible control should best fall, because it's not native to BroadWorks, but it is a valuable tool for the BroadWorks operators to use and administrators to use to get that done. So I'm interested to know where that best fits and shakes out now that BroadWorks is supporting Ansible. Also, there's a concept where there's some overlap with the network function manager here. And I was talking with my colleagues about that earlier, and whereas I saw the network function manager as preparing the way for network function virtualization for BroadWorks, being able to dynamically spin up servers and resources to provide users with BroadWorks services. The Ansible is really focused on software management and configuration management, as opposed to the EMS type features that I like to think of when I think of the NFM. Both of them can handle the licensing. Both of them can stage and distribute software, but Ansible is key to being able to automate the software activation, and that's the key distinguishment there. So looking forward, since this is kind of an early feature, Mark, what do you think BroadWorks management will look like in a few years? Do you think this will latch on? Do you think there'll be some competition for automation solutions?
You know, if you reduce the labor involved in setting up a new server, standing up a new server that's kind of fully patched, meaning it's running the latest software, and you reduce that to close to zero. So it's as simple as opening a new web browser or something, you know, something close to that. It's a very straightforward, it's a task that you don't think of as having any substantial expense. Then that will change the way people operate BroadWorks systems. You know, think the ADP is probably the easiest example because these things need to scale up regularly. Right now, if you needed to set up a new XSP, well, there's some real work in getting this up to date, getting it installed. Now, there's additional work with your firewalls and the rest of your network to prepare, and that Ansible may not take care of that on its own using only the playbooks from Cisco, but it gives you a hook. It gives you a place to do that same kind of work. So if I needed to modify my firewalls, potentially I could do that with Ansible at the same time when I add the new server. So I think it gives us some real opportunities to reduce that complexity and that cost of that labor work of setting up new servers so that we can spend our time on other things as well. I mean, those of you who've worked with ECG, you know, this is the kind of work that we do a good bit of. Well, it would be nice to actually just make this more efficient so that it takes a lot less time and therefore cost everybody less money. But it takes a lot less time to actually stand up and deploy these servers and put them to work. I think what we also need is the ability to push configuration into them to do the cross configuration. So if we genuinely want to say, well, I need new servers to handle device management, for example, I can readily go do that. If I need new media servers, I can readily go do that. I can add these new media servers. Now, I still need to obviously acquire the right licensing, but I can do the deployment of the media server very readily. And that will reduce some of the problems, some of the sources of sometimes outages due to it takes so long to stand up something new. It'll allow operators to optimize how things are organized better. They'll be able to sort of relocate services between virtual hosts or cloud hosting providers more readily. So I think that's naturally going to have some real positive benefits for how people run their networks.
Gotcha. Hey, John, did you know that the Cisco TAC engineers actually use Ansible to spin up and to keep up with the latest releases internally?
Didn't know that, but I'm glad.
Does that give you confidence that this is something that's not going to go away, that this is something that's a real new feature that will help, will stick around?
Yeah, it does. I mean, we all know that BroadWorks is particular about things in the underlying operating system changing out from under it. And so I think that it is really important that BroadSoft and Cisco that they are working towards supporting this well, that they're working towards giving some guidance on how to use it, and that they're using it internally. I think there's going to be growing pains if a service provider is rolling this out, but I think that those growing pains will be worth it.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's cool to have automated configuration management where you can execute a mop the same way each time. There's a fancy little term called, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but idempotency that Ansible uses to describe, thanks, to describe the idea of, well, other computer scientists use it too, but to describe the idea that when you execute a task, the node or the server, it should be in the same state no matter how many times you execute that task. Mm-hmm. So living by that kind of standard also kind of makes me feel like it's more deterministic. It's reliable. I am a little bit concerned from past experience with the different internal groups at some enterprises, service providers, working together, just like software engineers and network engineers working together. Now we've got folks that normally just handle the virtualization or the operating system. And they may already be using Ansible, or they may be using Salt or Puppet or another flavor to automate the configuration changes in the OS. And here BroadWorks provides Ansible to automate the BroadWorks configuration changes and software activation. And is there some synergies there that'll be found? Does it help with the conversation between the groups? I'm hoping it does.
Yeah. Okay, so if you guys have follow-up questions, here are our email addresses and phone numbers. We'll be glad to hear from you on anything you'd like to talk about. I've also got Trevor Wolford's contact information on there if you're looking to discuss a new project. But we're glad that you came. We will send out a follow-up email and let you know how to order your coffee mug. And you get to pick the one that you want to do that. And send any other questions that you've got, and please come back next quarter when we'll be telling you about new things that have come out and the directions that BroadWorks software is going in next year. So thanks, and have a good holiday season. Thanks, John. Thanks, Brian.